Hey Optimancers, Chris here. For the last few weeks I've been talking about Warlocks. On the first week I talked about Invocations, then I talked about Pact Magic and Mystic Arcanum for Warlocks, then we talked about specific spells, and today I want to talk about the Pact Boons and the Patrons for Warlocks. Now if you missed any of the earlier videos, I'll put links in the video description if you want to check them out. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be talking about the various Pact Boons and Patrons available for Warlock. These are all pre-Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, so anything that comes out in Tasha's will not be covered in today's video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically go through all the abilities and I'm going to discuss my opinions of each of those abilities. But if I'm going to talk about Patrons, I should talk about my patrons because I have a Patreon and I have some patrons who make a huge difference to this channel. And today I want to recognize Jonathan Haynes, Kurt G, Lyric, Matt Couch, Nick Lutz, Philip Martin, Scott Ballantyne, and Scott Dunnington. Thank you all so much for your support. And if any of you are interested in checking it out, the link to my Patreon page is in the video description. And so let's get started with Pact Boons and Warlock Patrons. So what I normally do when I review things is I give them a color coding. So today we will be using my standard color coding system. And those colors are red if I think a feature is going to be pretty useless. Orange if I think it is going to come up way too little, as in it's too circumstantial, or I think it's kind of on the weaker side. Purple if I think it's okay. Green if I think it's good. Blue if I think it is great. Now, for anyone who is colorblind, don't worry, we'll use stars beside each of the abilities as well. If you see 1 star, I've rated it red. If you see 2 stars, I've rated it orange. 3 stars for purple, 4 stars for green, and 5 stars for blue. You'll also notice that in the timestamps for this video, I'm going to write down the ratings as well, so there should be no problem with you being able to figure out what I've rated each of these things. As always, these are just my opinions. Mechanically speaking, a lot of things are subjective, but this is where I would put each of these abilities and features. So at 3rd level, you're going to make your decision for which Pact Boon you are going to choose. So if you are just dipping Warlock for a level or 2 levels, you won't get a Pact Boon. Now if you are going with more levels of Warlock, Pact Boon is going to play a significant part in the type of Warlock you make. There's 3 options. I'm going to go over them in no particular order. The first one I'm going to go over is Pact of the Blade. So this stereotypically is going to turn your Warlock into a weapon user. You create a Pact weapon, it takes an action, takes the form of a melee weapon, and no matter what melee weapon you choose, you're automatically proficient, and it's automatically considered magical for the purposes of bypassing resistance. It disappears if you use the ability again, or you dismiss it as a free action, or you die, or it's more than 5 feet away from you for a minute or more. You can make an existing magic weapon into your Pact weapon. This takes an hour, which you can do during a rest, and this doesn't work if that magical weapon is an artifact. It also doesn't work if that magical weapon is sentient. So there's a few things I want to talk about with Pact of the Blade. The first is, if you are planning to use a Warlock that specializes in weapon use, I think you kind of have to take Pact of the Blade. Some of the invocations that are only available to Pact of the Blade are required to be effective with weapons. But if you are not a Hexblade, there are some issues with taking Pact of the Blade. And the first issue is that you are working off light armor. Light armor is not going to give you a good armor class, so if you are going to be going into melee, and of course your Pact weapon has to be a melee weapon normally, that is a problem because you're going to be going in, you have not great hit points, you're going to have a bad armor class, and you are very likely going to be downed very quickly. The second issue is that with Pact of the Blade, it does not allow you to use your charisma bonus for attacks or damage. You have to use your strength or your dexterity depending on the weapon. Hexblade is the way around this. If you are a Hexblade, your Pact weapon is always going to use your Charisma bonus for attacks and damage, but for every other kind of Warlock, it doesn't. So that means if you want to play anything but a Hexblade as a Warlock, and you want to use Pact of the Blade, and you want to be effective as a melee combatant, I think you kind of have to multi-class. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to take a lot of levels in another class. You could take a single level of fighter, and it is going to solve a lot of the problems. Still, you're going to have that issue where your weapon is using a different ability score than your spells. That's, again, not necessarily the end of the world. You can actually focus on the ability score you need for that weapon and maybe pick spells that are not so dependent on your charisma. And that can work just fine. Now, with Pact of the Blade, you don't necessarily have to be a melee warlock. With improved Pact weapon, you can choose a ranged weapon as your Pact weapon, or you could still just focus on Eldritch Blast. Maybe melee is going to be a secondary thing for you. I don't think this is the best way to make a Pact of the Blade, because part of the reason you're taking Pact of the Blade is for access to invocations that aren't going to do you any good if you're focusing on Eldritch Blast. Still, I think if you take a Warlock and you're focusing on Eldritch Blast and you take Pact of the Blade, it's not the end of the world. And there are other ways that Pact of the Blade could be useful. If you are playing in one of those campaigns where magic weapons just aren't happening because your DM is stingy and you're coming up against creatures that need magical weapons to bypass their resistance, remember, you can actually give your Pact weapon to somebody else. Somebody else is allowed to use your Pact weapon. The only limitation is if they take it out of 5 feet range from you for more than a minute, it disappears. But that minute is probably going to last the entire combat. So you could create that Pact weapon that is, say, a spear, hand it off to your Polearm Master Paladin. They go in, they have a magic weapon for the combat, and after a minute it disappears, you create another one. Again, I don't think this is the best strategy in most cases, but I could see it being pretty useful in those few cases where you have those campaigns where magic weapons are rare, and when they're rare, your martial characters absolutely need them, so then you being able to provide them as an action that doesn't use up a resource for you is actually a pretty big thing. And then in that case, you might focus on Eldritch Blast, and you might not just worry about taking any of the Pact of the Blade invocations, because frankly, if you are focusing on Eldritch Blast, there are plenty of invocations that are not Pact specific that you're going to want to take. But if you do want to be a weapon user, this is the way you got to do it. Because this is going to be the invocation that's going to give you the ability to make an extra attack with your Pact weapon. This is the Pact that is eventually going to give you bonus to damage to all your weapon attacks equal to your Charisma bonus. So these things are kind of essential if you want your Warlock to focus on weapon use. Now if you do this, that doesn't mean you can't use Eldritch Blast effectively as well. It really depends on your build, but as long as you can have a good Charisma score, especially if you're something like a Hexblade, then it's pretty easy to raise your Charisma score. It's going to help your weapon use. It's going to help your Eldritch Blast. And as long as you take Agonizing Blast and Eldritch Blast, throw a Hex spell on there, you're going to be okay with damage. The next Pact Boon I'm going to talk about is Pact of the Chain. This is my personal favorite. If I'm playing a Warlock, this is the one that I'm drawn to first most often. What it does for you is you learn the Find Familiar spell. You're able to cast it as a ritual. And when you cast a spell, you can choose one of the normal forms for Find Familiar, which you should never do because the special forms are so much better. And the special forms you have to choose from are Imp, Pseudodragon, Quasit, or Sprite. Now, I think some of these are better than others, but all of them have at least some property that makes me glad they're on the list. In addition, if you take the attack action, you can forgo one of your own attacks to have the familiar attack with its action. Now, when you are Pact of the Chain, you probably are only attacking once in a turn if you're taking the attack action, so basically you give up your attack, familiar can attack instead. I think once you get to level 5 or higher, this is pretty much never going to be a good idea. At levels 3 or 4, it can be okay. Now, before I get into specifics here, this is my regular disclaimer whenever I talk about Find Familiar. When you are taking Pact of the Chain, you are not getting an Imp, Pseudodragon, Quasit, or Sprite Familiar. The Monster Manual has rules for these creatures becoming familiars if that happens through gameplay Pact of the Chain is not giving you an Imp Pseudodragon Quasit or Sprite Familiar. That's not happening. What is happening is you are getting a Spirit as a Familiar, and that Spirit is either Celestial, Fiendish, or Fey. That Spirit takes the form of a creature, which can be any of the Player's Handbook versions, as well as the extended choices here. Every time you cast a spell, you can have that Spirit take the same form or a different form. Your Familiar doesn't die. If it falls to 0 hit points, it disappears, but you cast a spell again, and it reappears. You can have the Celestial Spirit take the form of an Imp or Quasit. There's no reason why you can't do that. Honestly, I kind of like the idea of a Celestial Imp. The next thing I want to mention is that not all the forms are created equal. The Imp form, in my opinion, is the best form. This gives you flight. Gives you 120-foot dark vision with Devil's Sight, which means it can see through magical darkness. It has magic resistance. It has immunity to fire and poison. It has lots of damage resistance and base 10 hit points. It can change shape into a rat, raven, or spider, but note that their statistics don't change, except for their movement. So you're not getting blind sense with spiders, for example. You do get invisibility at will, and its attack is potentially better than yours at level 3 and 4. And so it might even be worth using the Familiar instead of your own for attacks. But against a tough creature, this is likely going to mean that your Familiar gets bonked. Now, Sprite is my second favorite form. You also get invisibility at will and flight. You have a unique ability that allows you to detect the alignment of a creature that you touch, and it's guaranteed to work with Celestials, Fiends, and Undead. Now, it can use this ability while invisible, but it has to touch the creature, so it could be dangerous. But when it comes to stealth, the Sprite is the best, because not only do they have invisibility, but they have a +8 modifier to stealth checks, and those two things go together really well. And its attack is unique, as it does have a chance to poison or even render a creature unconscious, though this does require a very bad saving throw. Again, this might be worth a try before level 5, and with a Sprite, you can do this from range, so it's a little safer for the Familiar. Like most Familiar forms, Sprites will disappear if attacked almost automatically. They do not have good hit points, and it is also worth noting that the Sprite is the one of the special Familiars that does not have dark vision. Quasits are my third favorite form. Now, they lack flight, but they do have some good abilities. They, like the Imp and the Sprite, have invisibility at will. They're immune to poison and resistant to a number of damage types, and they do have magic resistance. 7 base hit points isn't bad for a Familiar. They can change into a bat to get flight, a centipede to get climb, or a toad to get swim speed. So this means that the Quasit is the only Familiar form you can take where you can access flight, climb, and swim with the same form, but it does require you change shapes in between. Like with the Imp, only the movement changes, you don't get their other statistics. Their attack can poison a target, but the save isn't very hard, and unlike the Sprite, they don't have a chance to render the target unconscious. They do have a scare ability, and this is available once per day. It's a DC 10 wisdom save, so not a hard save, but it is worth mentioning since it's not an attack, so they can do this on their turn. One thing I definitely don't like about the Quasit is they have no natural flight ability, so unless they are in the bat form, they're not going to be able to fly. The one that I find is the weakest is the Pseudodragon, but still, it's better than any of the base Familiars in the game. It does have a higher speed flight than the Imps or Sprites. It also has blind sight for 10 feet, so that's kind of unique for the greater Familiars. And it can't speak, but it has a telepathy of 100 feet. Now, it's a limited telepathy, so it can only express ideas, emotions, and images. Still, that's pretty decent communication. That could potentially work around language restrictions, maybe better than a comprehend languages ritual. So you might find that if you need to communicate with some creature that you don't share a language, the best ritual you might be able to cast is find Familiar to change your Familiar into a Pseudodragon to get that telepathy ability. Its attack has a poison similar to the Sprites. It has a DC that is 1 higher. However, its attack roll is lower, and it only works in melee. And it can't be done from invisibility, so there's a lot of downsides to the attack. But, you know, with the limited telepathy, the blind sight, and the higher fly speed, it just increases the versatility of the Find Familiar spell for you. And it's probably not the form I would choose most of the time for these creatures unless I wanted to access one of its abilities. Because remember, just because you normally have an imp doesn't mean you always have to have an imp. Cast Find Familiar as a ritual and change your imp into something else, and then change that into something else. And then maybe at the end, change it back into an imp again. Remember, in the end, your familiar is a spirit that takes different forms every time you cast a spell. Just remember that every time you cast Find Familiar, it is going to cost you 10 gold pieces worth of charcoal, incense, and herbs. Now, 10 gold pieces isn't a huge amount. Even at first level, it's not a huge amount, but at higher levels, it's nothing. But you still need to have those materials, and you need to have them consumed in a brass brazier. Now, brazier is a little bit like a portable barbecue, and there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to carry around a brazier with you. So if you have Find Familiar, you absolutely should. Another thing I wanted to mention about Pact of the Chain is do not forget about any ability that hands out temporary hit points to everybody, because temporary hit points are big for these familiars. Whether it's a Protector Cannon, or the Inspiring Leader feat, or Mantle of Inspiration from a Glamour Bard, or whatever. Don't forget to add those temporary hit points to your familiar. An imp getting Protector Cannon bursts is actually really beefy. And the final thing I want to mention about Pact of the Chain is if you're going to take Pact of the Chain, take Voice of the Chainmaster as an invocation. This is a campaign-changing invocation, and I think it's an absolute must for this pact. The final Warlock Pact I want to talk about is Pact of the Tome. This gives you a Book of Shadows. The Book of Shadows alone isn't that great. You get 3 cantrips from any spell list. They are considered Warlock spells for you, so if they would normally use Wisdom or Intelligence, they will use Charisma instead. And if you lose the book, you can replace it easily enough. You do a 1-hour ritual, you can do that during a rest. But if you want Pact of the Tome to be an effective pact for you, number 1, you must take the Book of Ancient Secrets invocation right away. This pact is not worth it unless you take that invocation. As far as the cantrips go, I will note that if you took something like Shillelagh, it would allow you to use your charisma for attack and damage in melee, and provide you the ability to bypass resistance to non-magic weapons. You can combine this with something like Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade, and that's not terrible, but I should say that it's not great either, though it does give you something to do if you are caught in melee. Also, I'll say, I would always take Guidance. I think this is probably your best choice for your cantrip selections. It is one of the best cantrips in the game, and normally not available to Warlocks. I think it's also not a terrible choice to just take more cantrips that are already available to Warlocks. Grab Mage Hand, Minor Illusion, Message, or whatever. These aren't bad choices for Pact of the Tome. Last thing I want to mention about Pact of the Tome is I've often heard this idea that Pact of the Tome can duplicate the other pacts, since they can get Shillelagh and Find Familiar through Book of Ancient Secrets, but honestly, not really. Pact of the Blade invocations are necessary to being an effective weapon using Warlock. Pact of the Dome cannot access them. Chain Pact Find Familiar is so much better than the standard Find Familiar. Pact of the Tome doesn't get that. So they are a poor replacement for Pact of the Blade, a poor replacement for Pact of the Chain, though I absolutely would say that if I'm Pact of the Tome, I'd consider Shillelagh. I'd definitely take Find Familiar. Just don't fool yourself into thinking that's as good as those pacts. It's not. My favorite thing about Pact of the Tome is access to ritual casting, because ritual casting is something that really improves the versatility of a character. The thing I don't like about Pact of the Tome is you don't get a lot of rituals to start, and you have no automatic way to access rituals later. You really gotta rely on a DM that's going to give you access to scrolls or to spell books or whatever to get more rituals into your Book of Ancient Secrets than you started with, because if you don't, then I don't think Pact of the Tome is all that great. Okay, so let's go over the patrons. These are available right at level 1, so if you're dipping Warlock, you're going to get a patron. and they do have continuing abilities that you gain as you level up. You're going to get something at level 6, you're going to get something at level 10, and you're going to get something at level 14. Also, depending on your patron, you can have an expanded spell list. So this means when you select spells, you're going to have additional options. Again, these are not like domain spells where they're automatically known. These are just more options for you. All these patrons I think are okay, but I do think that the best one, far and away, is the Hexblade. I mean, we kind of have to do this one first. Hexblade is the best patron mechanically, and it is not close. This patron gives so much at level 1, it becomes an effective dip for almost any other class. Their abilities at level 6, 10, 14 aren't terrible. They're nothing compared to what they get right at level 1. But what they get at level 1 is so much. It makes, when I'm concerned, this patron vastly superior to all the others at all levels. So first let's talk about the expanded spell list. The level 1 access to Shield and Wrathful Smite are astounding. But once again, these make this a great dipping class. Or this make this a good class to dip in something else that's going to give you first level spell slots. Because neither Wrathful Smite or Shield are things I'm necessarily going to want to be spending higher level spells on. But let's go over what we're getting at first level here, because this is crazy. The first thing we're going to get is Hexblade Curse. This is an insane ability. It's a bonus action to use, and you get it back on a short rest. It does your proficiency bonus in extra damage to the target on every single damage roll. Note that if we multi-class out of Warlock, this is something that's still going to scale with level. So the way this works is, if you cast Magic Missile with a first level spell slot, you're going to get this bonus 3 times. If you use an attack, you crit on a 19 or 20. If your target dies, you recover your Warlock level and Charisma modifier and hit points. The only downside to this ability is the range, which is 30 feet. But this ability is amazing. But Hexblades are different than most Warlock patrons in that they get more than one ability at first level, because they also get Hex Warrior. I mean, why not? Let's give the Hexblade more at first level. Lots more. You get proficiency in medium armor, and with shields. So have a free moderately armored feat. Want more? Okay. We'll give you lots more. Pick a weapon after your long rest, and as long as it's not a two-handed weapon, you can use a Charisma modifier for attacks and damage. Want more? Okay. If you are Pact of the Blade, you get this bonus for any Pact weapon as well, even if it is two-handed. So, everything this class gets at level 1 is ridiculous, and I think actually poor design, because this puts first level Hexblades and first level every other Warlocks and potentially every other class in the game, regardless whether they have a subclass or not, on different levels. And so it really does. It comes to the point where we start seeing clerics with a level dip in Hexblade, sorcerers with a level dip in Hexblade, wizards with a level dip in Hexblade, paladins with a level dip in Hexblade, bards with a level dip in Hexblade, and it just gets silly. But it is so good at first level, and that first level gives so much that this becomes the greatest subclass combination at first level in the game. But what if we continue on with Hexblade? How good is it then? Well, I think it is still the best subclass simply because we got so much at first level, and the stuff we get at higher levels, a lot of it's okay, but I don't think it is as dramatically good as the first level stuff. So next at level 6 we're going to get Accursed Specter. The downside here is this feature is something you may not always get to use. You have to kill a humanoid. Encounter no humanoids, you don't get to use this. However, if you do get to use this, this is actually pretty powerful. You get a Specter for the rest of the day that follows your commands. And in combat, Specters are okay, and we are going to get bonuses to combat. But here's the thing I really want to mention. Specters can go through walls, or floors, or ceilings. They can fly with hover. They're immune to a boatload of conditions and damage types, and they're resistant to a boatload more. Now, they get temporary hit points equal to half your Warlock level, and a bonus to hit equal to Charisma modifier. These are big boosts right off the bat. Expect +7 for this thing to hit. The scaling isn't good though, but just for the ability to move incorporeally alone, this is a pretty good ability. I just think that the scaling here is a little too slow. Now at level 10 you're going to get Armor of Hexes. This allows you to potentially turn a hit into a miss using your reaction, and only against one attack, and only against the target of your Hexblade curse. So, in the end, this one is a stinker. Though I will note, it is one way to actually negate a critical, which a shield spell can't do. At level 14, we get Master of Hexes. This allows you to switch your Hexblade curse to a new creature when the original dies. This is really only useful if the battle is still going on. Still, Hexblade curse is awesome, and so adding another target is good, even if technically speaking this isn't as good as getting the ability in the first place, which did occur at level 1, and this ability is level 14. Still, that level 1 ability is so good that getting extended use of it is still a pretty good ability. So that's the Hexblade, which I think just needs to be mentioned first. So let's talk about the rest of the patrons for those of us that want to play a Warlock that isn't a Hexblade once in a while. And I'm going to present these just in alphabetical order, because honestly, I think these are all okay choices. I think none of them are bad choices. The first one I want to talk about is the Archfey. Now, Archfey has an expanded spell list that I think is the best of the spell lists at low levels. Sleep is amazing for a first or second level character. Phantasmal Force can be overpowered depending on your DM. Plant Growth also can be overpowered depending on your DM. Greater Invisibility is a solid spell. This is a pretty good spell list overall, but I do think it skews largely to the lower level spells. And it's a good thing too, because the level 1 ability of Archfey blows. It is a terrible one. Affects a 10-foot cube emanating from you, so there's no ranged use. 10-foot cube is a small area. We're talking 4 squares. Creatures get a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, they're charmed or frightened for 1 whole round. Once you use this, you need to use a short or long rest to get it back, but the question is, was it ever worth using your action to do this in the first place? Probably not. So as far as class features go, you only get your first decent class feature at level 6, and that's Misty Escape. This one's okay. If you take damage, you can use your reaction to turn invisible and teleport up to 60 feet to somewhere else you can see. There's something weird in the wording here. It says you remain invisible until the start of your next turn, or until you attack or cast a spell, but you use your reaction to use this ability. So how are you attacking or casting a spell before your next turn? I don't know, but I mean, it's not a big deal. It's just some weird wording I thought I'd mention. This is usable once per rest, and I think it's a decent ability. It's nothing too special, but if you are about to take a ton of attacks, this could be very good. At level 10, you're going to get Beguiling Defenses. This one, I think, is decent. Charm doesn't come up a whole lot, but it does come up sometimes, and immunity is terrific. You can use your reaction to charm the creature who tried to charm you, which is pretty cool, but note that it's not necessarily the same effect. So it's just the charm condition. So if you maybe are targeted with a hypnotic pattern, for example, you counter that, you're not necessarily going to incapacitate them even if they fail their saving throw. They're just going to have the charm condition. And finally, you get Dark Delirium at 14th level. If we want to simplify this, basically, this is a 60-foot range, single target, save or suck, targeting wisdom saving throws. It inflicts the Charmed or Frightened condition, so beware of immunity to those conditions. And as long as it works, for 1 minute during that time, that creature is basically going to be out of the action, and you can use it once per rest. So, single target, save or suck. I mean, it's not my cup of tea, but if I'm getting it as an additional ability, I'll definitely take it. So that's the Archfey. Let's talk about the next one. That's the Celestial. Celestial is maybe my favorite of the non-Hexblade Warlocks. It's worth noting that Celestial is currently the only pact other than Hexblade that gets multiple abilities at level 1, though I think this is largely semantics, because one of those abilities is extra cantrips, and another one of those abilities is a feature. Well, if we look at the Undying, they combine the extra cantrip and the feature into the same ability. So that's kind of semantics. And I should mention that the level 1 abilities, not nearly as good as the Hexblade, but I do think that as far as the other packs go, this might be my favorite, and it might be my favorite because I tend to like Chain Pact the best. and Celestial and Chain Pact go extremely well together. And that starts right with the expanded spell list. If you are Chain Pact, Cure Wounds is a standout. Now, there's Lesser Restoration, Greater Restoration, Revivify. These are all good spells circumstantially, and I could definitely see putting them on my list. I could also potentially see Flaming Sphere or Wall of Fire being useful. And I should note that those spells, and some of these spells, are the only way we get to use our 6th level feature effectively. Now, first level, we're going to get some bonus cantrips. We get Light and Sacred Flame for free, so in addition to our regular Warlock cantrips. Light is a decent cantrip for anybody. And Sacred Flame would not be my first choice, but there are a couple reasons why I don't think it's useless. First, it ignores cover, so we could, for example, blast away at a creature we've thrown into a force cage. Second, it benefits from our 6th level feature. Now, Eldritch Blast is going to be your better choice 99% of the time, but there is that 1% of the time, so I don't think it's useless, but it absolutely would not be my go-to attack cantrip. The other thing we get at first level is Healing Light. I think this is a pretty decent ability. It's basically a bunch of extra healing for you. You get a number of d6s equal to 1 plus your Warlock level that you can dispense as a bonus action on your turn to a creature within 60 feet, including yourself. Because this isn't a spell, you can go ahead and cast a leveled spell with your action on the same turn. You can spend a number of dice equal to your Charisma modifier at one time. The pool recovers on a long rest, and once again I should point out this works out very well with Chain Pact. Seriously, Celestial Warlock should take Chain Pact. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with regards to Cure Wounds and with this ability, I'm talking about Gift of the Ever-Living Ones, where if you heal yourself with an ability, all the dice are treated as maximum, as long as your familiar is within 100 feet of you, which is not hard to do. So for example, you're a 3rd level Warlock, and you have this ability. You're going to use it on yourself. You're going to use 3 dice, and you don't roll, you just heal 18 points. As a bonus action. That's awesome. Level 6 we get Radiant Soul, and if you read through this, I think it does sound better than it actually is. I mean, I'll take resistance to any damage type, but radiant damage comes up almost never. So of all the types of resistance I could have, radiant is maybe right at the bottom of the list or darn close to it. You also get a bonus to damage to radiant or fire spells, but Eldritch Blast is neither of those, and adding it to your spells does not necessarily make them as good as Eldritch Blast. That doesn't mean it's useless. I'll take resistance and a bonus to damage on one of my targets of a Wall of Fire, for example, but these are small boosts. At level 10, we get Celestial Resistance. I like this one. Now, it is redundant if anyone in your group has Inspiring Leader or similar temporary hit point spreading. Otherwise, this is good. You get temporary hit points equal to your Warlock level plus your Charisma modifier. That's probably anywhere between 13 and 15 right away when you get this ability. And you get it every rest, long or short. You can also grant temporary hit points to your allies, and that's going to start between 8 and 10 temporary hit points. Now you chose Chain Pact, right? Because you're going to be giving these temporary hit points to your familiar as well. You know, your Celestial Imp. And then at 14th level, we get Searing Vengeance. Now, I don't know how often this will come up, but when it does, it is pretty dramatic. When you go down to 0 hit points, remind the other players that you are okay, as long as your DM isn't one of those mean DMs that has the enemy beating on your unconscious body. Because when it is your turn, and it's time for you to make that death saving throw, boom, you have half your hit points, you get up from prone for free, and you do damage to creatures of your choice within 30 feet, it's not a lot of damage, and they are blinded for the rest of the turn. Now, not the round, just the turn, so only against whatever you do with the rest of your turn, because you still get your movement, you still get your action, you still get your bonus action, all of it, and they don't have a saving throw against the blind effect. This isn't necessarily going to come up all the time, and you do need a long rest to recover this, but when it does come up, I think this is a pretty dramatic ability. So that's the Celestial. Let's go to the other end, to the Fiend. Now, I like the Fiend actually quite a bit as well. The expanded spell list here, if you like to blast fire, this is the list. You got Burning Hands, Scorching Ray, Fireball, Wall of Fire, and Flame Strike. They're all here. Now, I should mention, I do not recommend most of these spells at any level. Just pointing out they're here. For me, Fireball is the standout, and I very likely might take Fire Shield as well. Now the Fiend gets pretty good features all the way through. At level 1, they get Dark One's Blessing. This is a good feature. Kill a hostile creature, you get temporary hit points. It's likely going to be 4 temporary hit points at first level. That's not a whole lot, but it scales, and eventually it's going to cap at 25 temporary hit points. That's actually a lot, and considering as a Warlock you're a damage dealer, you're going to be able to take advantage of Dark One's Blessing fairly often. Again, it can be redundant depending on the other abilities that other characters have in the party. I mean, if we have, say, a Artificer blasting away with their Protector Cannon, Dark One's Blessing isn't going to do a lot for you. But if that's not the case, Dark One's Blessing I think is a good feature. I really like the next feature though, Dark One's Own Luck at level 6. You get a D10 bonus to an attack roll or a saving throw, and you get it after you roll. So you rolled poorly, I'm going to add a D10. If you were to, say, dip Divine Soul Sorcerer, you could potentially do this and Favored of the Gods. I mention this because these abilities are very similar. They're still from different sources, though, so we can stack them. And just like with Favored of the Gods, this one recovers every short or long rest. Next one we get is Fiendish Resilience. This is at level 10. Again, I think this is a good ability. I mean, I'll take Resistance, and Resistance to the damage type of my choice is the best resistance of all. And we can switch it with every rest. So, yeah, we can choose Bludgeoning, we could choose Slashing, we could choose Piercing, but note that magical or silvered weapons still bypass this. Any of these 3 might be a good choice. Personally, I would expect slashing damage to come up the most commonly of the 3. Still, depending on the situation, I could see picking an energy type as well. Fire, cold, and poison are all pretty common types of damage. So this is a floating resistance, and that's awesome. Next, at level 14, we're going to get Hurl Through Hell. This is a very fancy way of saying we're going to do 10d10 psychic damage to a target you hit with an attack once per long rest. Now, it's a perfectly decent ability, and it's going to up your damage once per long rest, but let's just be clear, that's the primary use, without some very fancy tactics in very circumstantial situations. Most of the time, just a damage boost. So the next patron I want to talk about is the Great Old One. I see this one get dunked on. Personally, I think it's solid. The expanded spell list I think is good. A number of standout options here. Dissonant Whispers and Tashes are both good at low levels, or if we multi-class another spellcaster so we have first level slots, then I would keep them. They're both good spells. Phantasmal Force, as I mentioned before, can be game breaking with a lenient DM. Sending can be a super useful circumstantial spell, as can Clairvoyance. Ever's Black Tentacles is a good battlefield control. Telekinesis is a very solid spell. Someone just mentioned to me that if you were to take Glibness with your Mystic Arcanum, it would work very well with Telekinesis. That is true. But even without that, I think Telekinesis is solid. This is a good list. If we are looking at a higher level Warlock, I think it's actually the best list. So, what about the abilities? Well, at first level, we get Awakened Mind. This is an unlimited 30-foot telepathy. Now, it is only one way. You can talk to them, and they can't talk back, but I still think pretty useful, and hella flavorful. At level 6, we're going to get Entropic Ward, and this one is okay. You give a single attack disadvantage with the reaction. That's fine. Getting advantage on the next attack if the affected attack misses is also fine. Once per rest, fine. I mean, overall, fine. At level 10, we get Thought Shield. As I've mentioned multiple times in this video, I'll take any resistance. But I must say, Psychic would not be my first choice, but I will also say it's probably better than Radiant Resistance. Also, you do damage the creature that caused the psychic damage, which is always immensely satisfying. Immunity to having your thoughts read against your will is probably something that will never see gameplay. Then at level 14, we get our disappointing ability. This is Create Thrall, and it sounds so good, but really it isn't. You cause the charm condition with no save to an incapacitated humanoid. This could be a humanoid you incapacitated with your Tasha's Hideous Laughter spell, for example. The issue is that the creature is charmed, but that's it. The charmed condition means it can't attack you, it means you get advantage on charisma checks against it, but that's all it does. It doesn't allow you to control them. you aren't really getting a Thrall. That doesn't mean this is never going to be useful. You want a sleeping target to be charmed by you. You could potentially use Create Thrall while they're sleeping, and then they wake up and they have the charm condition, and that could be useful in certain situations. So I'm not saying this is a useless ability, but this name of Create Thrall I think is misleading. And the final patron I'm going to talk about is the Undying. This personally is probably my least favorite of all the Warlock packs, though I still think it's okay, and I think in an undead heavy campaign, I think it's quite powerful. I should also mention this one is technically specific to the Forgotten Realms because it's from the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, so maybe check with your DM if you're not playing a Forgotten Realms campaign. The first thing is the expanded spell list. I think there are some okay spells here. Blindness, Deafness is an okay spell, and it does scale well, which works well with Pact Magic. Silence is circumstantially good. Death Ward, Contagion, definitely some decent spells. I just don't think there's any real standouts as far as I'm concerned. At first level, we're going to get Among the Dead. This gives you, number 1, Spare the Dying for free as a cantrip. This is not a bad cantrip. We also get advantage on saves versus disease. That's not going to come up in most campaigns, if at all. The big thing here is that in an undead heavy campaign, undead are going to have a hard time attacking you. This is almost like a permanent sanctuary versus undead. If we look at the sanctuary spell and we look at this ability, we see a lot of similarities. And there are similar limitations to it. But sanctuary is really good, and this is really good if we're facing undead. So if your campaign has lots of undead, this is really good. If you are not facing undead, it's useless. At level 6, we're going to get Defy Death. This is okay. You regain hit points. It's a similar amount to a Cure Wounds spell when you stabilize a creature with a Spare the Dying cantrip or you succeed on a death save. This is only usable once per long rest. It's not terrible, but it is kind of barely passable. At level 10, we get Undying Nature, which I think is a cool ability. I don't think it is a powerful ability. You don't need to breathe, you don't need food, you don't need water, you don't need sleep, and you age at a slower rate. These are flavorful abilities that honestly have minimal effect on actual gameplay. And then at 14th level, we get an ability that sounds really good. Indestructible Life. What you get in actuality is a bonus action self-heal equal to your Warlock level plus a D8. That D8 is small enough portion of this that Chain Pact isn't really benefiting that much. Expect somewhere around 19 hit points of healing when you first get this ability at 14th level, usable once per rest. I mean, it's not terrible, but this is pretty minor. The part of this ability that is unique and neat may never come up in your campaign. You can reattach a severed body part, and that sounds really cool, but technically it's likely never going to come up. So that are all the packs and patrons for Warlocks. Next week I'm going to present a Warlock build that is a straight Warlock, and it is not going to be Hexblade. So I hope you'll join me for that. In the following weeks after that, I'm probably going to be talking about Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and so I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you next week.